Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1879. The wind swept down over the foothills near Rawlins, carrying with it the faint smell of sagebrush and a silence too deep for the hour. It was near sundown when Nolan Merritt first saw her alone, kneeling in the dirt beside a small grave tucked behind the clapboard church, her hand resting on the carved stone like it was still warm. She was talking. Softly. Words meant only for the ground. He had only come into town for feed and nails, but something about the shape of her shoulders, that quiet way her grief folded around her like a second skin, made him stop. The townsfolk called her touched. Talks to the grave most days, the storekeeper had muttered earlier, nodding toward the churchyard. Some say she lost her mind when the child passed. Some say she never had it to start with. Nolan had not said anything then. And he did not say anything now either. He just watched. The woman stood slowly, brushing the dirt off her skirt, plain brown calico faded by the sun, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Her name was Sela Garrison, he remembered now. She had come to Rawlins 2 years ago with a husband and a baby boy. Husband died in a mining accident 6 months in. The baby, Jace, had not made it through his second winter. She stayed. Folks said she should have gone back east. But she stayed. Nolan did not know why that sat heavy in his chest, but it did. The next morning, he saw her again. She was carrying a basket of laundry to the creek behind the boarding house, her boots too thin for the rocky path. He tipped his hat as he passed her. She nodded politely, but her eyes flicked away quick, like she had gotten too used to being stared at. 2 days later, he saw her in the churchyard again, sitting beside the grave, talking low while the wind stirred her skirt. He stood at the gate for a long moment, then pushed it open and walked in. She looked up, startled. "I can come back," Nolan said. Her mouth parted slightly, but she said nothing. "I am not here to bother you," he added. "Just figured no one ought to sit alone every day." Sela looked at him for a long time, then back to the small headstone. "He would have been 3 last month." Nolan nodded. "I reckon he was real loved." Her eyes shimmered. "Still is." He sat down beside her. Not too close. Just enough. She glanced at him, unsure. "They all think I lost my mind. I do not. You do not know me. Still, I do not." They sat there until the sun dipped low, casting gold across the grass. She did not speak again. Neither did he. But he stayed until she stood. That night, Nolan could not sleep. He lay in the cot at the livery stable, staring up at the beams, hearing her voice repeat in his head, "Still is." The next day, he brought her a small wooden carving of a horse. "For Jace," he said, setting it on the grave. Her hand covered her mouth. She did not speak, but her shoulders trembled. After that, they sat together often. Sometimes she talked to the grave. Sometimes she told stories about Jace, how he used to reach for her braid, or how he said "Mama," like the M was stuck in his mouth. Nolan listened. Always listened. And slowly, she started looking at him longer. "Why do you come?" she asked one day, her voice quiet as the breeze. "Because I want to." "You do not pity me?" "No. I just—" He paused, then looked down at his hands. "I lost someone too. Long time ago." Her eyes softened. "Who?" "My sister. Virginia. She was 12. Fever took her." "I am sorry." He gave a small nod. "You never really stopped missing them." "No," she said. "You just learned to breathe around the hole." That night, Sela stood at the edge of the churchyard while he adjusted his saddle before heading back to his camp in the hills. "You could come for supper tomorrow," she said, her voice careful. "If you wanted." He looked up, surprised. "I would like that." She gave a small smile, tight and unsure, but real. The next evening, he arrived with a basket of dried apples and a bottle of coffee substitute. The house was small, tidy. There were 2 chairs at the table. She had only set one. He pulled the second one out. "May I?" She hesitated. then nodded. They ate stew in silence, but it was a warm one. Her hand shook just a little when she passed him the bread. Afterward, he helped her wash the dishes. "You do not talk much," she said. "Never saw the use in filling the air just to hear myself. I like that." He turned to her, hands still wet from the wash basin. "I like you?" She stilled. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve. He did not move. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No one said that in 2 years." He looked at her, steady. "Then it has been too long." They stood there, close, not touching more than her fingers at his wrist. But it was enough to make the room feel warmer. When he left, she walked him outside. "I will be back tomorrow," he said. She only nodded, but her eyes stayed on him even after he walked away. The next morning, the town was talking. Word spread fast in Rawlins. "Cowboy's been keeping company with the grave talker," the saloon keeper said, shaking his head. "Shame. Thought he was reasonable." Nolan ignored them. He showed up anyway. And every day after that he came. Brought a new carving for the grave every week. Talked less and listened more. Fixed the squeaky hinge on her door without asking. Repaired the fence behind the house. After one long day, she brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the porch. "You do not mind what they say?" she asked. "I care what you say." She looked at him, really looked. And then she leaned in and kissed him slow, like she was trying to remember what it felt like to be wanted. When she pulled back, she whispered, "I have not done that since. You do not owe me an explanation." "I want to give you one," she said. "Because I am not broken. I am just bruised." His hand found hers. "Then let us heal in the same place." That night, she let him stay. Not because she was lonely, but because she was ready. And when he wrapped his arms around her, she did not cry. They lay quiet, the wind brushing against the walls outside, and the hush between them was peace. By early June, the thaw had made its way to the edges of the land, coaxing green from brittle branches and sending meltwater down the hills in narrow, determined streams. Sela stood at the edge of her small garden with her sleeves rolled, hands in the earth. Her nails were packed with soil, her back aching from the morning's digging, but it was the right kind of tired, the kind that came from tending something that might live. "I brought seed," Nolan said as he came around the side of the house, lifting the small burlap sack. "Weren't sure what you had left." She looked up from her crouch, sun catching the curve of her jaw. "What kind?" "Beets, mostly. Some cabbage. Not much, but I figured. I'll use it," she said, brushing her hands clean on her skirt. "Thank you." He passed the sack to her. She didn't flinch when their hands touched. She untied the knot and peered inside. "Cabbage grows well here, if the frost doesn't come early. I could build you a cold frame. Use salvaged glass from the old rail station." Her brow lifted slightly. "You'd do that? If you want it." She nodded once. "I do." They worked side by side that afternoon, the sun warm but not yet heavy. Nolan cleared the rocks from the back edge of the yard while Sela laid out rows with a carved stick. She didn't speak much, and neither did he, but the quiet between them had changed. It wasn't watchful anymore. It was settled. Later, as the light thinned and the mountains caught fire with the setting sun, she brought out a basin of water for their hands. He scrubbed the dirt from his palms, then looked at her face streaked with sweat and dust. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked. "Sometimes. But I don't." "Why not?" She tipped out the basin and watched the muddy water pool into the dry grass. "Because everything I've loved is buried here. And now." He waited. "Now something good is growing again." He didn't answer with words. Just reached out and touched her wrist, lightly, as if asking. She leaned into it. That night, they sat on the porch with their boots off, watching the stars come out. Sela had brought out a thin quilt, and when the wind picked up, she tucked it around both of them. "You always stay outside so long?" she asked. "Used to," he said. Before I came here, I'd ride fence for weeks. Sleep under the sky. Some nights the only sound was my horse breathing. Sounds lonely. Sometimes. Other times, it was the only place I felt like myself. She folded her legs beneath her and looked up. You feel like yourself here? I do now. She didn't say anything to that, just rested her head against his shoulder. The weight of her was light, but it anchored him in a way he hadn't known he needed. In the days that followed, they fell into rhythm. Nolan mended the back steps where the boards had gone soft. Sela took in mending from the schoolteacher and the widow Barlow, earning enough for sugar and lamp oil. They ate together most nights, always with 2 plates, always with the lamp turned low and the windows open to the prairie. One afternoon, as Nolan was shaping a flat stone for the garden path, a boy from town ran up, breathless. Miss Garrison, the pastor said to tell you there's a woman asking for you at the church. Says she's your cousin? Sela's face went still. She wiped her hands on her apron, then glanced at Nolan. I'll go. I'll walk you. No, she said quick. Then, softer. I'll be all right. He watched her go, her back straight, skirts catching on the wind. She didn't look back. She didn't return until near dark. When she did, her face was drawn, her mouth tight. He stood from the porch bench as she approached. You all right? She wants me to come back with her. To St. Louis. He didn't speak. She says I'm not fit to live alone out here. Said I've lost sense? He stepped closer. What did you say? I said no. Her voice caught, then steadied. She told me I'd be better off in a place where people don't whisper. Where I could forget. Nolan waited. She doesn't understand. I don't want to forget. You don't have to, he said. Not ever. She looked up at him then, something fierce and grateful in her eyes. I told her I have a life here. That I'm not alone. No, he said. You're not. She reached for his hand, fingers rough with work and weather. He held it firm. Inside, the lamp glowed warm behind the window. The evening was quiet but not empty. She was still bruised, and he was still learning how to stay. But when she leaned her head against his chest and he wrapped his arms around her, neither of them flinched. And for the first time in years, she slept through the night. The wind turned sharper in July, though the sun still bore down heavy most afternoons. Sela stood in the shade behind the house, slicing strips of muslin into binding. Her cousin had sent a letter, short and unsigned, containing only a train schedule and a note that said simply, "There's still time." Sela had folded it once, then again, and tucked it into the stove before striking a match. Nolan had noticed the smoke curling from the chimney despite the heat, but he didn't ask. He came around back with a pair of rusted hinges in his hand. "Barn door won't hold through another storm," he said. "I'll fix it before sundown." She didn't look up. "I never asked you to stay." "I know. You could have gone weeks ago." "I know that too." She set the muslin aside. "Why haven't you?" He crouched to inspect the lower hinge. "Because this feels like the first place I've belonged in years. I don't want to be a place someone settles because they're tired. You're not." He stood and dusted his palms off on his trousers. "You're the reason I sleep easy. That's not tired. That's something else." She didn't speak, but her hands stilled where they rested in her lap. Later that week, a new woman came into town from the east, pale and full of questions. She asked after Sela at the mercantile. Asked again at the schoolhouse. Sela saw her from a distance near the dry goods store, her dress too fine for the dust, her mouth set like stone. That evening, as Nolan cleaned his bridle out on the step, she sat beside him without a word for a long while. "She was Jace's godmother," she said finally. "Wasn't close to me, not really. But she always thought she knew better." He waited. "She's here to convince me I've wasted my life. That staying means I've stopped living. You going to let her?" "No," Sela said. "But it makes me angry that I still have to say it out loud." Nolan didn't answer with words. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small square of folded canvas. Inside was a set of tools she hadn't seen before, not his usual carving knives, but finer ones, clean and precise. "I was a smith's apprentice once," he said. "Didn't take to it, but I learned enough to get by. Thought I might build something that lasts." She turned toward him, brows drawn. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I started drawing up plans for a shed. A real one. One you could store winterwood in, maybe keep chickens. But I won't build it unless you want it." The silence between them deepened, but it wasn't empty. "I want it," she said. That night she pulled the quilt tight around them as they lay in the dark. Her voice came quiet in the hush. "I never thought I'd let someone stay again." "You didn't let me," he said. "You made room." She pressed her cheek against his chest. "I still talk to him, you know. To Jace. Some days I wonder if he'd be proud of me. He'd be proud you kept going. I didn't know I had that in me." "You do," Nolan said. "And I see it every day." The next morning, they walked together to the churchyard. She carried a fresh sprig of mint, and he brought a small, smooth stone with Jace's name carved into it. They placed them both at the head of the grave. Sela knelt, her voice low. "I wanted you to know, baby. There's someone here now. Someone who sees us, both of us." Nolan stood behind her, hat in hand, the wind tugging gently at his sleeves. After a moment, she rose and turned toward him. "I'm ready," she said. "For what?" "To build something," she said. "Not just the shed." He nodded, slow. "Then let's begin." And they walked home together, the path behind them long, but the path ahead clear. The shed took shape in quiet stages, first with the posts sunk deep into the dry earth, then the beams notched and joined without waste. Nolan measured twice and cut once, his movements patient and sure. A pair of barn swallows nested near the rafters before the roof was even finished, as if they trusted what was coming. Sela kept to the garden while he worked, but her eyes drifted often to the sound of hammer on wood. She didn't interrupt. She brought him water when the sun stood highest and ran her palm along the new boards in the evening, her fingers catching on the grain. One morning, she brought him a small bundle wrapped in linen. "Found these in the bottom of a chest," she said, setting it beside the tools. "Carving knives. My husband used to whittle after supper." Nolan unfolded the bundle slowly. The blades had dulled, but the handles were smooth with use. "I'll sharpen them," he said. "They deserve that." "I think he'd like that they're being used again." There wasn't much else spoken that day, but she stayed near, weaving a length of willow for the garden fence, her hands moving by memory. By the week's end, the shed stood straight and sturdy, with the doors hung true and a small window set high where the light came in soft. Nolan didn't say much when he stepped back from it, just nodded once and wiped the sawdust from his sleeve. Sela opened the door and stood in the center of the floor, her arms folded across her chest. "It smells like something honest," she said. He leaned against the frame. "It's yours now. I want it to be ours." He looked at her then, not surprised, but steady. "You sure?" She stepped closer. "I didn't think I'd ask that of anyone again. But I know what I want now." He reached out, brushing a bit of sawdust from her cheek. "Then I'll stay." That night, she made cornbread from the last of the flour, and they ate by lamplight, the windows open to the warm hush of summer. She spoke of things she hadn't said before, about the days after the fever took Jace, how the quiet in the house had turned heavy, how she'd stopped lighting the stove for a time because it felt wrong to warm a room he wasn't in. Nolan didn't interrupt. He reached across the table once, not to comfort but to be there. She let her hand rest in his, the hush between them no longer hollow but whole. In the days that followed, they began to build more than walls. She brought home 2 hens from a homesteader 3 miles west, and Nolan reinforced the coop with spare planks. They traded with the widow Barlow for a bolt of ticking and stitched 2 pillows by hand. One afternoon, Sela came in from the line with a small wooden box in her arms. "I found this out behind the church," she said. "Someone left it at Jace's grave." Inside was a folded quilt square, stitched with bright yellows and greens. Nolan studied it. "Someone's trying to say something. I think maybe they see us now. Not just what we lost." He set the square on the table and looked at her. "What do you want to do with it?" She smiled, not wide but sure. "Let's build a bigger quilt." By midsummer, the townspeople had stopped looking sideways when Nolan walked with her down the main street. They nodded, some even tipping their hats. She didn't expect kindness, but she didn't flinch from it either. One evening, as they sat beneath the cottonwood behind the house, he handed her a folded page. "I wrote to my brother," he said. "Told him I wasn't sleeping in saddles anymore." She opened it carefully. The handwriting was rough but clear. "He'll be glad," she said. "I told him about you. About the life we're making." Sela folded the letter back and gave it to him. "Then let's keep making it." They didn't rush anything. The rooms stayed simple, the meals plain. But each day added something small: a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, a new latch on the pantry, a row of hooks beside the door for his hat and hers. She still visited the grave, but now she sat beside it with a basket of sewing or a jar of jam cooling in her lap. She still talked, but sometimes she laughed, too. And Nolan was always nearby, not watching her, not guarding her, just being where she could find him. When autumn crept in, slow and gold, she stood at the edge of the porch one morning and turned to him. "We should marry," she said. He lowered his saddlebag to the step. "Is that how you want it? I want you inside this house when the snow comes. I want your name beside mine on the church roll. And I want something that can't be taken away because someone else thinks I'm broken." He walked to her, quiet as ever, and took both her hands. "Then say when." She didn't hesitate. "Before the leaves fall." He kissed her then, slow and certain, right there in the morning sun, and when they pulled apart, she was smiling, not the small, careful smile she'd worn for years, but something new. Something wide and alive. They stood there a while longer, the breeze lifting around them, and the world, for once, didn't ask anything more of them than that. The morning they wed, frost clung to the edges of the creek, thin and silver. The hills beyond Rawlins were dusted pale, and the air carried a crispness that whispered of first snow. Sela brushed her hair out at the washstand, the window open to let the cool in. She wore a cotton dress the color of oat straw, stitched at the cuffs with thread she'd dyed herself from onion skins. It was simple, had belonged to her mother once, but she had mended it with quiet care, and it fit her well. She stepped outside with her shawl around her shoulders and found Nolan tightening the cinch on his mare. He didn't turn at first, just ran his hand along the horse's neck, then looked up. "That's a kind color on you. It's what I had." He came to her then, took her hand. "It's more than enough." They rode to the church together, not speaking, just letting the sound of hooves and wind fill the space between them. Pastor Elridge stood waiting beneath the cottonwood, a wool coat buttoned to his throat. Beside him, the schoolteacher, Miss Aileen, held a small ledger and a pen already inked. There were no pews, no guests, no music. Just a patch of earth warmed by sunlight, and the sound of leaves readying to fall. "Do you come of your own will?" the pastor asked. "I do," Nolan said. Sela nodded. "I do." The pastor spoke the words with reverence, aged hands steady. When it was done, he stepped back. "That's all the world asks of you," he said. "The rest is yours to shape." They signed their names in the ledger, hers first, the ink slow where her hand trembled, and then Nolan helped her up into the saddle again. Back at the house, he carried her over the threshold, not because tradition asked it, but because he wanted to. She let out a breath that nearly turned into laughter, and he set her down with care, brushing a bit of wind-tossed hair from her brow. They ate supper together by the fire, stew made from the last of the summer squash, and cornbread still warm from the hearth. She poured the cider they'd pressed in late August and handed him a cup. My father used to say a marriage should begin with something given and something kept, she said. What are you keeping? My name, she said. And the land? He nodded. And what are you giving? She set her hand over his. The rest. That night they lay beneath a quilt piece from worn shirts and leftover muslin, the window open to the hush of the prairie. Her fingers traced the slope of his shoulder, not searching, just learning. I used to think I'd always be in mourning, she said softly. I never wanted to replace what came before. He murmured. You haven't. You grew beside it. He held her close, and she pressed her nose to the hollow just above his collarbone. They woke before dawn, the fire burned low but still warm. She rose first, stoked the coals, and set the kettle on to boil. He came behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. Outside, the wind had stilled. The first snow had not yet fallen, but the land felt ready for it. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. I do. What do you see? He kissed her temple. A long stretch of quiet mornings. A harvest we plant together. Maybe a child if it happens. She turned to face him. And if it doesn't? Still you. Still this. She smiled, leaning her forehead against his. Then I reckon we'll be all right. They spent the winter side by side, her stitches finer with each passing week, his hands callous from splitting wood and planing boards. They shared meals with neighbors when the road allowed, traded cider for salt pork, and mended what they had instead of reaching for what they didn't. By early spring, the hens had begun laying again. Sela gathered the first egg in a basket lined with wool and brought it to him where he stood fixing the porch rail. She held it out, careful as if it were made of glass. First of the season. He took it from her, cradling it in his palm. Then we're starting new again. They buried the old seed beneath warm soil, watched the creek swell with meltwater, and planted a row of young cottonwoods beyond the shed. Sela marked the tallest with a strip of blue ribbon. For the years to come, she said. And years did come. Each season added something small, a maple sapling, a second room onto the house, a carved cradle Nolan made by hand the spring their daughter arrived. They named her Virginia, after the sister he still missed. She grew up knowing the sound of wind through cottonwood leaves and the warmth of her mother's arms. She learned that grief didn't mean absence, and that love could be quiet and still be fierce. They grew older in the house they built, never once apart. The shed stood solid through all weathers, the garden came back each spring, and the grave under the churchyard tree never went untended. And in the evenings, when the light grew long and the air turned soft, they sat side by side on the porch with their hands still joined, still home, still whole.